I recently built this Tamiya T-72 in an Iraqi desert scheme, and in today's video I'll be taking you through all the steps I took to weather it using pigment powders. Welcome back to the bench, I'm Paul. This model represents a Republican Guard vehicle operating in Kuwait in 1990. That means we're going for a very dusty, worn, slightly beaten up look across the whole build. Unfortunately, the main painting footage was lost, which is a shame, but pigments are best used as one of the final weathering steps anyway. So even without that early footage, everything you see here will still make sense and should still serve as a clear start to finish guide. The first thing I do whenever I work with pigments is cover my cutting mat with a sheet of paper. These powders can get messy quick, seriously they travel everywhere, so stopping the mess at the source is far easier than cleaning up dust from every corner of the room afterwards. For pigments I'm using Revell's pigment set. I've had these for a few years now, they're about €15 for 6 colours, and I still haven't come close to running out of any of them. The brand really doesn't matter too much, pigments behave quite similarly across the board. Today I'll mainly be using the black and red-brown colours for soot and rust tones, as well as the white and sand yellow pigments for all the dust effects later on. As I mentioned already, this model is mostly finished. It's painted with acrylics and weathered with oils. Let's move into the pigment work. For applying pigments, I always use a cheap soft brush. There's no need to risk damaging a good brush, and soft bristles work far better for this particular job anyway. You'll see why in a minute. I begin with the black pigment to recreate soot and grime around the exhaust area. I dip the brush in, load up just a little bit of powder, and then tap it onto the surface instead of brushing it on directly. Tapping gives a far more natural look. Once the initial powder is on the exhaust, I'll blend it outward into the nearby panels and vents. A touch of red-brown mixed in helps suggest older corrosion and helps add a subtle tonal variation so the area doesn't look so flat. I tend to focus on corners first, anywhere where soot or dirt would naturally build up, and then I feather the pigment outward from there. After that first pass, I switch to a larger, soft brush and start blending everything together. That keeps us from having harsh edges or obvious marks where the pigment first landed. On the side exhaust, which already has some oil streaks and staining, I deepen the effect with pigments. The oil paints were great for giving longer directional streaks, but pigments help extend the soot staining left and right across the panel. This is where references are incredibly helpful. Looking at the real vehicle gives you a sense of just how dirty these areas get and where they get dirty. Next, I like to add small pops of colour wherever I can, and the stowage section is perfect for that. Adding pure red-brown pigment around the spare tracks give a fresher rust look, like these links were recently used and then set aside as spares. A solid, even orange tone would be boring, so I keep the rust concentrated around the guide teeth where the metal would naturally grind against the road wheels. Little decisions like these help make the model feel a bit more realistic. There's another engine element nearby and I gave it the same treatment as the others. One thing worth noting here is that I applied a matte varnish to the surface earlier, and pigments cling extremely well to matte finishes. On satin or gloss they slide around much more, but on matte they grab instantly. You can see how stubborn they are once they're down. To finish our soot effects, I add pigments around the edges of the barrel and I blend them away with the clean soft brush. It's a small detail, but it really helps to tie the weathering together. Before starting the dust effects, I decided to use an AK terrain paste to add some physical texture, basically built up dirt on the underside of the tank. This particular tub has been sitting around for ages, so it separated a bit, but with some mixing it worked fine. With a wet brush I scoop out a chunk of the paste and I spread it onto the places where dried earth tends to accumulate. Namely corners, recesses, the underside edges, that sort of thing. Because this paste is acrylic based, blending it with water is straightforward. It didn't show up too clearly on camera because the paste is nearly the same colour as the tank, but it still adds valuable texture. Later on when we add pigments, the textures areas will look far more realistic than smooth plastic. The front of the tank gets the same treatment, especially around the little shovel blade shape underneath the glasses. After the paste sits for a few minutes, I go back in with the brush and I break up the drying surface so the texture stays rough. These pastes can self-level if applied thickly, so this step brings back that gritty, clumpy look you want from dried earth. Terrain paste also does a great job at hiding imperfections like ejector pin marks that I didn't clean up under the mudguards. Those disappear instantly under a few dabs of paste. Since parts of the mudguard area are meant to represent rubber matting, I let some of the darker tones peek through. I also think about how mud would get kicked up by the tracks, so I add a little extra texture around the rear plate where it makes sense. I'm carefully doing all of this because I can't count how many times I've spotted a dried splatter somewhere I definitely didn't want it. It's much easier to wipe away mistakes while the product is still wet. Once the paste is dried a bit, I flip the tank back over and I begin the accumulated dust effects using the white and the yellow pigments. Same method as before, load the tip of the brush, tap off any excess and gently deposit it into the corners and crevices where dust naturally gathers. I can't stress enough how important reference photos are. The large soft brush is essential again for blending, giving everything a soft, realistic look. The V-shaped guard on the front of the tank is a perfect example of a dust trap. I place a generous amount of pigment in the inner angle and then I blend it outward. Even though I have both yellow and white pigments on the table, I mostly use the white because it represents the look of light, dry desert sand. When I reach the wheels, especially the green ones, the darker yellow becomes more noticeable and it stands out nicely. Dust settling into the recessed details looks especially good there. On the sand coloured wheels though, I switch back to white because adding pigment that matches the base colour doesn't really add interest. To clean away excess pigments on the wheels, I use a slightly firmer brush and I push pigment into the details while clearing it from raised surfaces. These wheels are sturdy enough that I can be a bit rougher. A fan brush gives the final cleanup, ensuring pigments that remain are sitting exactly where I want them. To keep things consistent, I remove the individual track runs so I can weather the full length properly. I start by randomly applying the same white and yellow pigments along the tracks. While I'm doing this, we're about halfway through the video, so if you're enjoying it so far, feel free to leave a like, subscribe, and drop any thoughts you have so far in the comments. At this stage, the track looks pretty chaotic, but blending things really brings it together. Eventually I start using the leftover pigment dust on the sheet of paper as a pre-mixed tone. It's actually really handy and saves dipping back into the jars constantly. When the full track run is coated, I grab a wide, stiff, flat brush to knock off the excess, letting the remaining pigment settle naturally into the cracks. The difference between the original rusty finish and the heavily dusted version is dramatic. Somewhere between those two extremes is exactly where we want to land. Not fully rusty, not fully sand coloured. Balance is the key. Next, I dampen the flat brush with white spirits and I wipe most of it off onto a paper towel. With the brush just barely moist, I make a single gentle pass over the tracks. This darkens the metal slightly and removes some pigment, but if you go overboard, you'll erase all the work entirely, so less is more here. I constantly adjust the brush depending on how wet or dry it feels. The goal is to keep dust in recesses while letting the original rusty tones show through. The wheel side of the tracks is less critical for this build because I plan to display the tank in a more urban setting. A quick, lighter pass is enough, most of that surface gets rubbed clean by the road wheels anyway. Next, I turn to the turret. Generally, I want less dust the higher up the vehicle you go. But crew boots would definitely track some dirt up around the hatches, so that's my main focus, along with front-facing details that catch sand while driving. The inside of the hatches get the same treatment. They don't have to be perfect, pigments naturally settle in the recesses and create a nice contrast. I'll also be adding figures later too, so things will probably get nudged around again. By this point, the terrain paste underneath is fully dry, so I go back and colour match it with pigments. The grit in the paste grabs the pigment extremely well, so I can scrub colour into all the little cracks and cavities. Focusing on corners gives the impression of layered dust built up over time. This process continues onto the upper hull where I apply the same strategies, looking at references, blending pigments with a clean brush, and using white spirits to manage areas that need a bit more control. I'm careful not to disturb earlier effects, particularly the soot and the oil work. With so many pigments on the tank, I'm also careful how I hold it. I don't want to smudge anything or leave fingerprints, so I grip the model from inside the turret ring. Some people use specialized stands or clamps, but this method works just fine. I'm rotating the model constantly, checking for areas that lack weathering or look unrealistic. Taking a short break can also help you come back with fresh eyes, and you might catch things that you'd miss otherwise. One of my favourite final steps actually doesn't involve pigments at all. I use a clutch pencil. It's like a mechanical pencil with thick lead to add a subtle metallic sheen on certain edges. By rubbing the side of the graphite along raised surfaces, I can quickly simulate metal showing through. I'm not outlining the model or tracing every edge, just highlighting areas that would naturally get scuffed through use. It's quick, effective, and really helps sell the tank as a heavy steel vehicle instead of a plastic toy. You can do the same thing with a normal pencil or a graphite stick, but I like the clutch pencil because the long exposed lead gives great control. I do this around the turret too. Even though it has many curved surfaces, there's still plenty of edges and corners that benefit from this effect. The storage boxes on the turret sides are especially good for this, since they get knocked around as equipment is handled. Thinking about how real crews might interact with their vehicles makes weathering choices so much easier. The pencil effect works beautifully on the rusted exhaust as well, bringing back a metallic hint without removing the rust tones. Even softer detailed parts like the engine deck plate look better with a bit of graphite. It subtly picks out details that the pigments may have softened. If the pigments blur details, the pencil sharpens them again. We're pretty much done now, so some people might suggest varnishing at this stage, but in my experience, varnish dulls the pigment effects significantly. So I'm just going to leave the finish as is, and I'll just handle the model carefully going forward. And with that, we're done. I hope you found this video useful, and I hope you enjoyed the final images of the completed effects. I meant to thank everyone for 500 subscribers in the last video, but since then we've actually hit 600, so thank you all so much. If you'd like to help the channel grow even further, feel free to leave a comment or share the video with someone else who might enjoy it. If you have suggestions or things you would have done differently, drop those in the comments too. I'll be back again soon with another video, most likely another figure painting one. And I'm hoping to get a lot done over the Christmas break, but we'll see how that goes. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.